And joining us now on the debate, Craig Alexander, Chief Economist with the TD Bank Group, Catherine Swift, President and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Randy Robinson, political economist with OPSEU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, Jonathan Chevreau, columnist at the Financial Post and a blogger at The Wealthy Boomer, and Alan Shapira, Senior VP at Aon Hewitt, the pension consulting company. Good to have everybody around the table tonight for what is always a complicated discussion as we try to figure out more about our pension system in this province and in this country. And to start with, I just want to read an excerpt. This was from a couple of months, or last month, I guess, in the Winnipeg Free Press to get us started here. Some 4.5 million Canadian workers belong to defined benefit pension plans. Almost 2/3 of these are employed in the broad public sector: public administration, education, healthcare, and social services. Defined benefit pensions are gradually disappearing in the private sector. Less than 1/5 of private sector workers are now members of such plans. Most private sector workers must rely on a combination of slim government pensions, that's Old Age Security and the Canada Pension Plan, contributions to registered retirement plans, and for some workers, defined contribution occupational pensions that don't guarantee any specific payout in one's retirement years. That's where I'd like to start. Catherine Swift, to you first. Defined benefit plans, defined contribution plans. Has the difference between these two plans created a kind of pension envy in this country?
Well, there's no question there's a big difference between the two plans, as you made very clear, the defined benefit plan being kind of the Cadillac plan that increasingly is only found with politicians in many instances, as well as public servants or people working for government. And I don't know, the pension envy issue I don't think really is the issue here we should be looking at. I think we should be looking at fairness, but also sustainability. We see around the world, the Greeces, the Portugals, the Italy, a lot of that, not the whole situation, but a lot of it was predicated on pension promises made sometimes decades ago that governments never put aside the money to actually fund. And now that the baby boomer generation's retiring, the rubber's hitting the road, the bill's coming due, the money ain't there.
I'm going to get to sustainability, but you don't mind if I want to pursue this little pension envy angle a little bit further. Okay. Randy, how about you? Is there pension envy out there now?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, pension envy, to me, there's a couple of things to be said about it. First of all, envy is a psychological condition, and it arises when there's a difference between two people, but it also arises when there's a little bit of a breakdown in social cohesion. When I think about my cousins in my extended family, which is huge, or the small town that I grew up in, or let's say the block that I live on, when I talk to people about doing well, somebody did well. They graduated from university with honors, they got a better job, they started a small business like an alpaca farm like my cousin has. When that happens, people don't say, oh geez, I wish she hadn't done that, she doesn't deserve that. They say, good for you. And I think we're becoming a society to a certain extent that doesn't say good for you anymore. That's increasingly saying, oh geez, they shouldn't have had that.
Jonathan, is he right? There are some people who look at those pensions that in particular public servants have, and they start to say, why have they got those and we don't?
Well, first of all, we all had a shot at those jobs. It's a question of what you decided to go into. I personally have a sort of mixed take on this because my own father was a high school teacher. When he died, my mother got 60%. It was a very nice income. My daughter, who's 20, looked at the same thing and said, gee, the summer's off, a great pension. I said, you're 20, what do you care about pensions for? So I, being the odd man out, sort of more like the private sector, like yourself, a journalist, we do have a defined benefit, but it's not what I would call gold-plated. So I don't think envy is really what it is. It's just a question of choice. If you don't want to, if you want a defined benefit plan, join the government. If you don't, you want to be an entrepreneur, become an entrepreneur.
Okay, entrepreneur. Which one do you prefer?
Well, I do think that there is pension envy out there, and I also think that it's likely to get more magnified as the years pass. At the moment, if we, according to Statistics Canada, if you have a public sector pension, you're most likely on average going to retire at age 58. If you're in the private sector, you're likely, or you don't have a defined benefit plan, you're likely to retire at 62.
Is all that still true?
But then they just recently came out with numbers that said on average you should expect to not only live 3 years longer, but work 3 years longer. So if you're 50 today, on average, you're likely to retire at 66. But I don't see, as long as the defined benefit plans that are present stay in place, that 20% of workers that have them are likely to still retire at around 58. So the gap is going to widen out to 8 years. And then, as we go forward, people that are 30, 40 to today, when they get to retirement, you're probably going to see the divide even getting bigger if nothing changes. So I think that there is an element of envy now. I think the point would be that the envy could actually get magnified as we go through the years.
Alan, do you share that view?
I think we're not answering or asking the right question that we need to answer, which is how do we get people to save for retirement? I think that's the fundamental issue, and the form which we deliver that retirement income, whether it's defined benefit, defined contribution, your RSP, that's not the issue first. You need to look at how do we get people to put more away. Retirement is expensive. We need to save a lot more. I think the other thing people need to understand is when we talk about saving for retirement, we have a number of uncertainties and risks we have to manage. We don't know when we put our money aside how much investment income we're going to earn over the long term. We don't know what our salary or standard of living is going to be at retirement. We don't know when we might want to retire or have to retire. And we don't know once we retire how long we're going to live. And so those are all risks and uncertainties that we have to manage in some form.
Except for all that, it's crystal clear.
Absolutely.
Now, Randy, there is and you help us with this, there's a widely held perception, I think it's fair to say, that the public sector's superior defined benefit plans are in effect paid for by the hard labor of the private sector employees who obviously through their taxes and so on give money to government which then go into funding these superior pension plans. And of course the folks who are in the private sector supporting those improved superior public sector pension plans don't do as well. They only have the defined contribution plan. How true is that perception?
Well, if I'm a user of public services, or if I'm a user of any service, I don't necessarily judge the value of the service I'm getting by how much the people who are providing it get paid. If I go to a car dealership and I like the car that I'm buying, I don't think, that was a bad value because that person is getting too much. Either it's a good value or it's a bad value. I think with the public sector, we have the citizens of the province, our customers essentially, who are buying these services. And so you have to ask yourself, are they getting good value for the service? If I look at the healthcare system, which in Canada, our healthcare system consumes just a little over 10% of GDP. In the United States, it's over 16% of GDP, and they have 50 million people who don't have health insurance, or if they do have health insurance, they'll never actually get to use it. So I look at that and I say, wow, that is a very efficient system. Now, that's me as a customer for public services. Me as a worker, I take a little bit different perspective on it. If I do have efficient public services, I say to myself, okay, well, I've saved that money compared to what I would have saved if I had an American-style system. What can I spend it on? Well, one of the things I could spend it on is good jobs. Because if I'm a worker, it doesn't matter where I work, the one thing I want to have in the economy generally is good jobs. And I don't really care where they are for a couple of reasons. One is I might get one of those jobs. Two is somebody I'm related might get one of those jobs. And three is if I'm a non-union worker, the presence of good jobs somewhere in the economy increases my bargaining power with my own employer.
Randy, I got to stop you there. I'm not sure you answered the question. The question originally was, is there truth to the perception that people in the private sector pay your pensions?
People in the private sector pay the pensions of public employees, as do public employees. And furthermore, people in the public sector pay the pensions of private sector employees when they buy the products that those private sector employees make.
Okay, so your members are all private sector people, right?
Absolutely.
Do they object to paying I mean, his original assertion was, if you're getting good service, you don't care what the person who's offering the service gets paid, you're happy with the service. Do you buy that?
Well, no, I don't. Basically, for starters, in many public sector pensions, the taxpayer actually pays a higher proportion. The Hoops pension is a good example. Hoops being the hospitals and the hospitals
of Ontario
pension plan. The taxpayer pays $1.26 for every dollar put in by an employee, just to give you that example. At the federal level, we're not talking federal, but it's about a third, two-thirds, the two-thirds being the taxpayer. In the OPCU pension, it's 50-50. But what we're saying here, too, is even 50-50, which you can say that's fair, because at least it's even-steven. But we're paying way more than we can afford to put away for our own retirement. And I mean, Jonathan, you mentioned, why don't you just go to work for government? Well, that would, if you take that to its logical conclusion, then we should all be government employees. Let's not forget who pays for the existence of government, the private sector. Government is not self-sustaining. So the notion that we can continue to have much better pay, because of course pensions are also predicated on a percentage of pay, and in the public sector it's usually 70%, much higher pay in the public sector for a comparable job in the private sector, much higher pensions that are guaranteed, and ultimately, I mentioned financial sustainability earlier, the rubber's going to hit the road. Let me mention just one brief. Ontario teachers' pension currently pays out $2 billion a year more than it takes in. How do you figure that? And that's just one example of many. How is that sustainable?
Well,
it's not.
They just changed it. That's how it will be. They just asked their members to contribute more.
It's nowhere near sustainable in its current form.
Okay.
But I think, well, that is, I mean, those plans, I mean, in Ontario, we have large public sector plans, and the way they are structured is that to the extent there's not enough money in those plans at a given point in time to fund the benefits, one of two things happens. The contributions for members and the employers go up, or the benefits being earned in the future get reduced. And that's why those plans will be eventually sustainable, because there's always these self-correcting or self-adjusting mechanisms that bring them back into equilibrium over time.
But taxpayers, you're asking your private sector taxpayer to pay more and more and more, and the more that you take out of their pockets, and how are you going to fund it? Teachers in Ontario right now, it's matched about 12 to 12, I think, so an overall 24%.
Sorry, what does that mean?
12% of the salary is contributed from the teacher, 12% from the rest of us, the private sector taxpayer. I don't know any private sector taxpayer out there that can afford to put 12% of their own income away for their own pension, and yet they're contributing it for the teachers. So
Craig,
it's a problem.
Where are you on this?
Well, I think at the end of the day, workers that don't have DB plans clearly have to work harder to save for retirement than those that do. I mean, the DB plans are on autopilot. They're going to put aside money every month, regardless of what the worker does. It gives you the guarantee, and the risk is all on the plan. Now, I do think sustainability is a very fundamental issue. I think the pensions in Canada are struggling with a low interest rate environment, which makes it incredibly difficult to meet the liabilities that they've assumed in terms of meeting the future payouts. I do think that at the end of the day, we're going to find that for DB plans, contribution rates are going to have to go up.
Contribution rates by whom?
The contribution rates by the workers are going to have to increase, because quite frankly, governments aren't going to have enough money in the kitty to meet all their other social priorities. But at the same time, when we think about people that don't have a DB plan, the investment risk has been transferred to them. And so ultimately what you find is that probably at the moment about 1/4 of Canadian workers are not adequately replacing their working life income for retirement. And when you do a projection, what you find is that ratio is going to increase. But most particularly what you're going to find is that workers that don't have pension coverage, it's going to increase the most. And one of the big challenges is when you transfer the investment risk onto the individual, you're basically assuming a certain level of financial literacy, or else the person might not end up in the world that they want.
Huh. We're actually going to talk more about that immediately after this debate. But I want to go back to some of the history here, Jonathan, and maybe you can help us with this. I always thought the original deal was, we're going to give you, if you work in the public sector, a better pension than you'd otherwise get in the private sector, and in exchange, we're going to pay you less. So less today, but more secure tomorrow. And that was kind of the grand bargain that society made. Is that still the case?
No, it turned out to be that not only do you have the better pension, the better benefits, the job security, and probably an absolutely higher level of pay. In fact, you could argue these great pensions and also deferred salary as well. If you look at the book that Catherine did the foreword to, Pension Ponzi, which is a good book on this whole issue, it talks about all the little tricks they have in the public sector. You know, like they spike, they get the last 5 years, they base the pension on their last 5 really good earning years, whereas usually in the private sector it's your average. It doesn't sound like a difference, but you'll see examples where the one way you get $40,000 a year, the other you get $60,000 a year. They got these SERPs, these supplementary executive plans, so the people that have got more than the 120 or so that you're allowed to have pensions, they can basically top up to a super pension for top executives. There's just many things that where the parity. So I think in that book, they're really saying let's take the 20% down to the level of the 80%, whereas people could argue let's bring the 80% up
to the 20.
Yeah,
okay, Randy.
Except that there's no money to do it. I'm sorry.
Well, let's just talk about the history of this a little bit. You know, there's so many numbers in pensions. It's all numbers, numbers, numbers. But to me, the most interesting number in pension world is 1985. 1985 is the year that pension coverage among Canadian workers peaked. And what basically has happened ever since then is that we've seen a decline, not a decline in public sector pension coverage, because it's stayed steady and has grown with the growing size of the public sector, but we've seen a really substantial decline in pension coverage among private sector workers. So I think it's important to understand the history of this and just to go back and say, okay, well, what conditions were in place that caused the private sector pensions suddenly to start declining? And I think a big part of the pension discussion that makes it a lot less complicated to think about it is really the value of your pension is just based on the contract that you have with your employer. They could be paying you in wages, they could be paying you in pensions, it doesn't really matter. But one of the things that happened in the early 1980s, actually ever since disco is when it started, was that we started to see, I blame disco for a lot of things, and this is one of them, we started to see wages starting to stagnate. And you know, the great promise of capitalism is that if your wages keep going up and your productivity keeps going up, your wages will go up too. And we saw that from World War II right up till about 1977, 1980, that period. And then all of a sudden, people's productivity continued rising, but their wages started to stagnate. And after a period of time, 1 or 2% every year, you get this serious problem where in 2008, Statistics Canada put out a report that said, you know what, over the course of 25 years from 1980 to 2005, the median Canadian worker saw their salary go up by $53. And this was in spite of massive productivity gains. And yet employers, I'm going to wrap up very
Randy,
quickly.
you're killing me here, baby. You're killing me. Honest to God. And this is twice in a row I've asked you a question, and you've taken me off in a history lesson in a different direction.
You know what? We need to know. Basically what has happened in what we call the neoliberal era is that employers have said, you know what? We're not going to pay workers as much as we used to. And yet we have these huge productivity
my question
gains
is simple.
that are worth $10,000 a year.
My question, Alan, you got it this time, is really simple, which is the deal used to be less money up front in salary and we'll give you a better pension. Is that still the case?
I'm not one to comment on the salary-pension relationship. I do know that pensions is a very important, integral part of the total compensation package that an individual in the public sector receives, and they understand that, and it's considered as they discuss total compensation. I want to go back to the point Catherine made, which is I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can all put away 4 or 5, 6% of pay in each year and have an adequate pension at retirement. And I think that's the fundamental issue. So yes, the teachers are paying 12% and the employers are also paying 12%. And in most public sector plans, the employees are paying somewhere between 8 and 12% of their salary each and every year from the first day they join the plan. And I think that's fundamentally what we're going to start to need to do, is people are going to start to have to contributing early and contributing consistently over time.
But if I can just comment on that example you gave, the 8 to 12%, if I put aside 8 to 12% for myself, nobody's matching it. If somebody in the public sector puts aside 8 to 12, say 12 just for the sake of argument, that means 24% of that person's income, so 24 grand if they're making 100 grand to make it easy. I don't have that benefit.
No, but
nobody's going to match my 12%.
Sorry, Catherine, that's the deal everybody who's in the private sector makes. They also get the right to go out and make as much as they possibly can.
But if you look at average incomes, Steve, average incomes in the government generally are anywhere between 25 and 45% higher if you include early retirements, wages, benefits, and they've never quantified job security, which is worth a massive amount of money. You know, the 2008 recession didn't happen in the public sector.
Craig.
So when we think about why, I want to go back to this point about why did the private sector stop offering defined benefit plans? Because it is contributing to the pension envy. And what we need to understand is that at the end of the day, the defined benefit plans that were introduced, these were entitlements that were developed in the post-Second World War era. And this was at a time when the economy was growing at a strong pace, when we had increasing women participation in the labor force, we had very strong productivity growth. And so as a consequence, income in Canada was rising at a very strong rate. That was creating very strong increases in tax revenues. And so it is a generalization around fiscal policy. It was really what new things and what new benefits can governments provide. The sad fact of the matter is that trend rate of growth has slowed. Productivity gains in Canada is remarkably bad. The labor force participation has peaked. So the labor force is slowing down, productivity growth is weak, and that means income is going to grow at a very, very slow pace. So what businesses have realized, and interest rates have come down to very low levels, which is fundamental to the ability of pension funds to be able to meet their financial commitments. So as a consequence, private sector companies looked at the pension obligations and came to the realization that there was no way they could afford these plans. And if you had a large workforce that had a lot of members with the benefits, very quickly they realized they couldn't afford them. And GM is a great example where by the time it went into bankruptcy, it was basically a pension company that made cars on the side.
Mm-hmm.
So fundamentally, the DB plans were not affordable. The only people that can afford them are governments that can actually raise money through taxes.
Alan, is that true?
Well, I think the problem is some of those, I agree with Kirk, some of those plans were designed at a time when the expectations were completely different. And I think what we're looking at now is those plans rebalancing how they share risk. And that's fundamentally the issue. So if we have all the risks I talked about earlier that we have to somehow share across either employees or employers, we seem to be talking about the models at either end of the spectrum, which is we transfer it all to the employee or we transfer it all to the employer. I think what public sector plans have done well, not all of them, but many of them, is they've tried to find a way to balance those risks, to share them in a different way between the employees and the employers. And I think if the private sector is going to adopt defined benefit plans, again, they're going to have to go down that road of figuring a way to have a better sharing of the risk between all the parties.
So, Jonathan, does it no longer make any sense for private sector companies to offer defined benefit / the superior improved plan over defined contribution plans?
Well, they'd rather not for all the reasons articulated. It's just too costly. And in a real world where they don't have taxpayer money, that naturally the profit motive would say, let's keep our costs down, put the risk on the employee. But remember that the government has these new pooled RPPs, PRPPs, which are going to be defined contribution in nature. And again, so even the government, when they decided to take sort of the model of what we've been talking about, public sector DB, they're saying, okay, for the rest of you, yeah, you got a little DB plan in the CPP.
Now,
but
let's
other
just
than
be clear. This is the federal government that brought this in.
The federal government
and it's
is
for those who don't have. Obviously, you're not an employee, so you don't have your own company pension plan you get into.
For small businesses and
people.
medium businesses who don't have an employer pension plan, about 3.5 million of these middle-income people, middle-income defined as 30 to 100,000, don't have a proper employer pension plan. So the government's saying, we're going to give you these pooled PRPPs. But again, they're not going to be defined benefit. They're going to be defined contribution. In other words, if the market goes up, great. If it doesn't, so sad.
Were you happy with that pooled pension plan
Well, we'll
that came
see.
forward?
The details aren't all out yet. It was one of the things we recommended, and we believe if it's implemented properly, yes, it could be helpful. And small firms, our laws in Canada as to how to set up a pension plan discriminate horribly against small businesses. You need a superstructure, a complicated, you need all kinds of advisors to set it up. So the notion of a simply administered plan that keeps the management fees down is desirable, and we don't know yet if we're going to achieve that, but if we do, I do think it'll be at least a part of the solution.
Do you think a day is coming? All of your Ontario Public Service Employees Union, which is how many tens of thousands?
125,000 probably.
125,000 employees. We've seen this in the private sector where new hires don't get the same deal as people who've been there already. Can you imagine a day when a new public servant will not be offered, when they sign on the dotted line, to come in with a defined benefit plan, but rather will be told, even though we're the government of Ontario, we're only offering defined contribution plans, because that's what we can afford?
Well, I wouldn't doubt that may occur. Certainly, the way if you talk about one of the pension plans we're in, which is the OPSU Pension Trust, we had a 54-day strike in 2002, which is basically about preventing the government of the day from seizing control of the plan. It's currently jointly trusteed, and we have equal control of those two sides. I don't doubt that the government's going to try it, but certainly there will be strong resistance to that.
Do you think this government will try it?
It could be this government, it could be the next government, it could be some government someday. I don't know the answer to that clearly.
One suggestion is for these hybrid, sort of give them half a DB plan and a half of a DC plan. So you have some market risk and some guarantee, which seems like a reasonable compromise.
And things like increasing retirement age. I mean, there's no reason someone in the public sector should be retiring that much earlier than the same person in the private sector who's footing the bill. There are a lot of solutions that can be reached, but I actually hear, because we've been very public, we've actually, at CFIB, we've been on this issue for over 20 years, if you can believe it, and we were a bunch of real lunatics 20 years ago. Now we're starting to look a little more on the ball. But anyway, but what's interesting is I'm actually hearing from young public service workers saying, I've done the math. I know this pension's not going to be there for me, and I feel very betrayed by my representation because, and right now, last week in St. John, New Brunswick, just to give you an example, they reduced indexation for existing retirees because they're broke. This is starting to happen in the smallest jurisdictions first because, of course, they have fewer taxpayers that they can kind of spread the mess around. Rhode Island is virtually bankrupt in the U.S., same kind of reason. It is absolutely going to have to, sadly, it's going to have to happen because it's not fair to people to make a promise to them. But unfortunately, these promises, we haven't even mentioned demographics. People are living tons longer than they used to. 30 years ago, they designed these plans for people to live to 75. They're living to 90 now. The whole fundamental model, and this is public sector and the private sector ones that are going away. So the whole model, unfortunately, has broken down. It's good to live longer, but you can't afford to pay a pension out for longer than somebody works.
But I think the question we have to ask, is it better to manage these risks on an individual basis or on a group basis? We pool everything we do in our normal life. We pool when we go and buy car insurance or home insurance or life insurance, we're pooling risks. And so the question is, can an individual do that work better than a group can do it? And I think the answer is no. There's lots of evidence to support that individuals aren't able to generate the same kind of investment income, for instance, at a low cost that a big defined benefit plan
And
can have.
nobody's saying that. I think we'd
And
all
I mean,
agree
if you
on
look
that
at the
point.
Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan, they put out a statistic. So of every dollar they pay out, 80 cents comes from investment income, which means only 20 cents has to come from member and employer contributions. So that's the value of the defined benefit model, is reducing the cost to the individual and the employers by making sure that managing a big pool of assets, you can generate sufficient investment income at a low cost.
That raises the follow-up question then. If that sounds like a superior way to go and it sounds like it's relatively affordable, why aren't more of those kinds of plans happening in more companies?
Well, I think from the private sector perspective, we've had a set of rules and conditions that have really made it difficult to implement the kinds of plans that are in the public sector. And the answer is that if that plan is going to work in the private sector, there's going to have to be a reconfiguration, a rebalancing of how those plans are adopted by the private sector. Because back to Craig's point, they were very fixed, guaranteed oriented when they were first set up many years ago.
Well, part of the deal, I thought also, Craig, was that, you've got to offer a superior pension plan to get the best people, because if you want to attract the best, you've got to offer the best. Right. Is that still the conventional wisdom out there?
Well, there's no question that there's going to be strong competition for skilled labor, and benefits factor into that calculation. I still think that as desirable as the DB models are, I don't see them coming back. I don't see them increasing in participation. I think there's scope maybe for more hybrid plans. So, providing some DB element, but not promising you 70% replacement of your income, which is the usual target. Maybe it's split evenly. Maybe you try 35% with a DB plan, and then the rest of it's a defined contribution plan, which means the worker's carrying some of the risk. I think the real fundamental question is, are there savings vehicles available for Canadians to reach the retirement income security that they require? I'm not convinced that the current system provides that. I think that the limits on RSPs and TFSAs, different tax saving vehicles, are too low. I think tax-free savings accounts are too low. I think that there should be lifetime limits that are dramatically higher than they are today.
I think C.D. Howe just finished doing a proposal for, was it $1 million worth of RSP room, right?
Yeah, and I think that the pooled registered pension plans could be very beneficial. I think that the real question about their success is going to be coverage, in terms of how many workers actually sign up for them. Because most of the research shows that whether you're in a DB plan or a defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan, you can actually replace 70% of your income, but you have to be part of the plan. The minute you are a worker that is trying to save for retirement outside of having some sort of registered pension plan, your odds of success is incredibly low the higher your income is. So for low-income Canadians, CPP, OAS, GIS, the income supplements from the government, they'll replace adequately for low-income Canadians. But for middle-income Canadians that don't have a pension, the odds of them actually reaching adequate retirement income is very low.
Let me ask Catherine about the highest income people. I think you did a piece in the Financial Post in which you talked about, who was it, the CEO of Ontario Power Generation?
Oh, that was the hydro, yes.
Who was
yes.
going to retire with what annual pension at some
I
point?
think that was over 700,000,
Yeah,
that particular one.
I think that's
also,
right.
he'd only worked there for 5 years, so that's a pretty good deal.
But again, the gist of this is we're not going to be able to attract the most skilled management talent unless we offer them the best possible pension plans.
Well, my problem with that, though, is that, again, let's get that down to the fundamental reality, that if you have the private sector paying for massive salaries in the public sector, what are you left with? You're left with grease. Government took over that economy, and we've seen what's happened there. Government is not self-perpetuating. You need a healthy private sector to support government, period.
Do they
That's
not
a
know
fact.
that? Do they not know that?
Doesn't matter, because what happens is, though, governments have procrastinated, fearful of union strikes and stuff in the public sector. They've been able to rag the puck, for many, many years. And now, what's really putting the finger on the problem now is demographics. The baby boomers are starting to retire. So suddenly, as I mentioned earlier, promises that were made 30 years ago, and governments happily said, oh yeah, well, somebody else will have to deal with this in the future. I'll cave into that salary increase. I'll cave into that, earlier retirement date and this added benefit, an extra week of holidays, whatever. I'll cave in, but somebody in 30 years is going to have to deal with it. And unfortunately, 30 years is now.
You want to come back on that?
Well, that's a very interesting notion that we can compare Ontario to Greece, because of course Greece is currently not being taken over by the government, it's being taken over by a banker. And I guess we have John Drummond here in Ontario doing that same role, but really there's no comparison between Ontario and Greece. Greece is the front page.
Can I tell you something? Don Drummond was on this program last week, and he said, I hope I've got the numbers right here, 15 years ago, percentage of GDP for debt in Ontario and Greece was the same. And here we are 15 years later, and of course Greece is off the charts, and Ontario is, I think in his view, heading uncomfortably towards that. So
Well,
we shouldn't, I think his point was, don't sit here and feel too smug.
That would be his point, but the fact is that Greece is on the front page of every newspaper in the world, and Ontario can't get on the front page of the Brandon Sun. So our debt problems are not all that they're cracked up to be by some people who would like to cut the public sector for reasons of their own. One of the things, though, that I think it's very important to talk about is we're having this conversation here as if we're in an era of scarcity. And I think it's a lot more accurate to say that we are in an era of scarcity in the midst of plenty. We have a situation in Canada where, according to the last StatsCan thing from the second quarter, Canada's corporations are sitting on $477 billion in cash.
Okay,
you're
taking us off course again here. We're talking about...
I'm trying to put it in context.
Okay,
the fact
that's the context.
is, employers have got money. A pension plan is money that an employer pays to workers. Until such time as employers realize that they have a responsibility to the people that work for them, we won't have a decent pension plan in this country. Right now, we've got a very good plan called the Canada Pension Plan, which should be expanded, but employers have blocked any expansion of that because they don't want to pay.
There is a mix here, though.
That's not true at all. And actually, I don't know if you know the highest level of job satisfaction for employees in Canada. Do you know where that is? It's in small and medium-sized businesses.
I don't
and
dispute
they are
that.
operating very marginally. If you think, data has shown time and time again that the average small business out there, which is half of our economy in Canada, Ontario and Canada, makes an average level of salary. Their profits, so-called, basically mean they're probably a middle-class individual. The notion that they can crank up the wages, benefits, et cetera, early retirements, whatever, to their employees by anywhere from 25 to 40%, the math does not work.
But we do have a balancing act here, which is, on the one hand, we can't have seniors retiring in poverty.
No.
Right? They got to have an adequate income, or else, right? I mean, that's you don't want revolution in the streets either, right?
Absolutely.
So we've got to find the sweet spot between adequate pensions and not bankrupting the people who pay for them.
Indeed. And the problem is, the more we suck out of the private sector workers' pocket to pay for it, and it's billions and billions every single year because they're unfunded. They're massively unfunded right now. Underfunded is the more technical term. I'll defer to our actuary around the table. But, the more you suck out of people's pockets, the less they're going to have to put away for themselves. And I'm sorry, there's a massive unfairness and unaffordability right now.
To your point, you're absolutely right. And up to this point, the income security system in Canada has done remarkably well. Canada has the 4th lowest poverty rate amongst seniors in the OECD, all the advanced industrialized nations. However, when you start looking farther ahead, what you start to realize is that, going to the point about demographics, the pressures are going to build, the fiscal pressures are going to become enormous. Governments are going to have to make very tough choices between where they put their finite resources. They cannot just raise taxes indefinitely to pay the obligations, because it will crush the private sector. So at the end of the day, they're going to have to get as much out of their money as they have, and you're going to have to start making choices between pensions and healthcare, and pensions and education.
Let's see how they do it down under. I got something here I want to read. We're asking whether this is the better way. Faced with the same issues that we are now facing, in the early 1990s, the Australians drastically overhauled their pension system, as well as voluntary savings and a means-tested government pension similar to the Canadian OAS. Australia has an earnings-based pension system called Superannuation that covers virtually all full and part-time workers. The contributions are mandated by law and are paid solely by the employer. Individual superannuation is managed by a fund of the worker's choice. Nothing is lost when employees change jobs, as the new employer continues to contribute to the same fund. The employer's financial obligation is limited to these contributions and ends when the worker retires. Alan, how do you like that?
Well, Australia has some of the worst senior poverty in the world. That superannuation approach has not worked very well in Australia. When you look at the average balance in those superannuation funds, I think it's something like 130, 140,000 for a male and 45,000 for a female. That's not a lot of money to retire on, and most people run out of money in that plan by the time they're 75, and they're living a lot longer than 75. So I don't think the Australian example has worked terribly well.
It's similar to the PRPP suggestion, really, except for the problem with Australia was the costs were so high because the financial services industry sort of just threw in their 2.5%.
Right.
If you're bringing Canada to PRPP and you get somebody like Vanguard, just index the whole thing at 20 basis points, then it would be fine.
Okay, hang
That's
on,
what you
Jonathan.
need.
English. What are you saying?
Management fees. is what
Management
I'm talking about.
I'm saying, yeah, in Canada we have very high management expense ratios for mutual funds and managed money and wrap accounts and insurance companies and seg funds, etc. If you just index with exchange traded funds, and Vanguard has just recently come into Canada, they're the cost leader around the world. They don't have to go the Australian route. The problem with Australia was all this high-priced active management. Most of the public sector pension plans are actively managed and quite costly. There is this lower cost solution. The other point I wanted to make was RSPs and TFSAs would do the trick.
Tax-free savings accounts.
Tax-free savings accounts and RSPs would do the trick if people maximize every year. The problem is they're not compulsory. So I think the good thing about that Australia proposal is that the pooling is good, the portability is good, and the compulsory or mandatory aspect is what I think is needed.
How do you like the fact that the employer stops paying into the fund as soon as the person retires? Is that a break for employers that they need?
Well, I don't actually see a problem with a system that says it's an equal share divided by the employer and the employee. I think that it is a benefit of working with a company. It's a benefit that the company can provide. So I'm not sure it's got to be 100% or zero. But at the end of the day, I want to go to the point about mandatory coverage. That's what I was trying to stress before. When you actually look at the vulnerability, the vulnerability of workers goes down dramatically if they are in some sort of retirement pension plan. And there is no question that if you pool the assets, you're going to have a lower cost delivery of the service that workers can benefit from. And unfortunately, I think we're in a low financial market return world for a very long period of time. So saving money on the management fees are absolutely essential.
Okay, the guy from the TD gets the last word. Thanks, everybody, for coming in today, and I think helping us understand the world of pensions a little bit more. Craig Alexander, the chief economist from the TD Bank Group, Catherine Swift, president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Jonathan Chevreau, columnist at the Financial Post, blogger at The Wealthy Boomer, Alan Shapira, senior VP, actuary at Aon Hewitt, and Randy Robinson, political economist with the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. Thanks all.
Thank you.